They didn't shout it. They didn't leak it. They didn't even dramatize it. They simply released a statement. And yet, within minutes, the entire United Kingdom seemed to freeze. Because buried inside those carefully chosen words was something no one expected to hear from a future king. Not compassion, not reconciliation, not restraint, but finality. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something right now, before we go any further. What would it take for a brother to publicly cut another brother out of history, not just emotionally, but institutionally? Because that's what many people believe just happened. When the statement attributed to Prince William surfaced, the headlines focused on tone, on language, on protocol, on what was said and what wasn't. But the real shock wasn't in the wording. It was in the implication. An implication that suggested inheritance, not just money, but access, legacy, and royal future, had been quietly, deliberately severed from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. And suddenly, a question that once sounded unthinkable became unavoidable. Was this the moment Prince William officially ended his brother's place in the royal future? Pause for a second. Think about how extraordinary that is. For decades, the royal family has survived scandals that would have collapsed any other institution. Affairs, divorces, explosive interviews, books, leaks, betrayals, even public ridicule. And yet, inheritance, real inheritance, has always remained protected, sacred, untouchable, until now. Or at least, that's how it appears. The reason this story has detonated the way it has isn't because people love drama. It's because inheritance, in the royal context, is not about wealth. It's about legitimacy. It's about proximity to power. It's about whether you are inside the system or permanently locked out of it. And when a future king appears to draw that line, the consequences echo far beyond family resentment. This is about the kind of monarchy Britain is heading toward. This is about how power is now exercised. And this is about a brother who may have finally decided that mercy is a liability. Let's rewind. For years, the public narrative around Prince William and Prince Harry has been framed as tragedy turned rivalry. Two boys walking behind their mother's coffin. Two brothers bonded by grief. Two young men who promised, at one point, to modernize the monarchy together. That image mattered. It humanized the crown. It softened it. It gave people hope that the next generation would be different. But something changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Slowly. Quietly. Piece by piece. Publicly, it looked like distance. Separate paths. Different priorities. Privately, insiders say it felt more like something else entirely. A recalculation. Because while Prince Harry was stepping away, speaking out, and redefining his life outside the institution, Prince William was doing the opposite. He was moving closer to the center, studying the machinery, learning where power really sits. And power, in royal terms, doesn't live in interviews or public affection. It lives in control. Control of narrative, control of access, control of inheritance. So when that statement appeared, measured, restrained, unmistakably firm, it wasn't read as emotional. It was read as strategic. And that's what unsettled people. Because this wasn't the language of a hurt brother. It was the language of a future monarch drawing boundaries. Now ask yourself this. Why now? Why not earlier, when tensions were louder? Why not during the interviews, the memoir, the public criticism? Why act at a moment when things seemed quieter? That question alone should make you uneasy. Because in royal history, silence is rarely peace. It's preparation. There's a reason senior royals are trained to wait, to observe, to let storms burn themselves out before stepping in. And if this interpretation is correct, Prince William didn't react emotionally to Harry's choices. He waited them out, which raises another uncomfortable question. Was this decision already made long before the public realized it? Think about the timing. The monarchy is under pressure. Public trust is fragile. Every move is scrutinized. And the future king knows something his younger brother never needed to consider. He will inherit not just a crown, but a system that cannot afford uncertainty. In that system, loyalty isn't optional, and separation has consequences. That's why this alleged inheritance cancellation, whether literal, symbolic, or somewhere in between, has hit such a nerve. Because it suggests that the monarchy is no longer trying to reconcile with those who walk away. It is moving on without them. And if that's true, then Prince Harry's greatest miscalculation may not have been leaving. It may have been assuming the door would always remain open. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle, not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a factor. Because whether people like it or not, her presence changed the equation. Not because she spoke out, not because she challenged tradition, but because she represented something the institution has always struggled with: independence. Once Harry and Meghan stepped outside the royal structure, they stopped being managed assets and became unpredictable variables. And institutions hate unpredictability, especially ones built on hierarchy, inheritance, and control. So when Prince William's statement landed, many observers didn't hear punishment. They heard containment. A message not just to Harry and Meghan, but to the entire system. This is the line. This is what happens when you cross it. And this is how the future will be governed. Still, nothing about this is simple. Because beneath the protocol and power plays lies something raw. A family fracture that no statement can fully hide. You don't reach this point without pain. You don't draw this line without history. And that's where the story becomes far more complicated and far more unsettling than a headline about inheritance. Because if Prince William truly believes this decision was necessary, then he also believes something else. That reconciliation is either impossible or no longer worth the risk. And once a future king reaches that conclusion, there is no reversing it. Here's the part most people are missing. This isn't about what Harry and Meghan lose. It's about what William is willing to sacrifice: public sympathy, family unity, the comforting image of brotherhood that once defined the monarchy's future. He's trading that for something colder, more durable: stability. And stability, in royal terms, often comes at a personal cost. So as the UK debates whether this was justified or cruel, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a calculated move. And calculated moves rarely happen in isolation. Because if this is how Prince William handles his brother, what does that tell us about the king he plans to be? What does it mean for the monarchy's future approach to dissent? And most importantly, what else was decided behind closed doors that the public hasn't been told yet? Because if inheritance was truly touched, even symbolically, then this story is much bigger than one statement. It's the opening chapter of a power shift. And the next revelation makes this one look almost restrained. Because behind that statement lies a history of conversations, warnings, and moments where everything could have gone differently, but didn't. And what happened in those private moments is where the real fracture began. So what were those private moments? What were the conversations that never made it into headlines, the warnings that didn't leak, the pauses that meant more than arguments? Because if this really was the opening chapter of a power shift, then the moment it became inevitable didn't happen on the day of the statement. It happened long before. And the first sign wasn't loud at all. It was subtle, almost invisible. Here's the question you should be asking right now. What if the statement didn't shock the UK because of what it announced, but because it confirmed something that had already been unfolding in silence? That's where this story truly begins. Not with microphones, not with press releases, but with a pattern that most people missed. For months, even years, royal watchers noticed something strange. Prince William stopped responding. Not publicly, privately. No counter leaks, no friendly briefings, no soft corrections, just absence. And in the royal world, absence is never accidental. When Prince William withdraws, it isn't because he's overwhelmed. It's because he's calculating. This is a man raised inside an institution that teaches one brutal lesson early. Emotion is temporary. Structure is permanent. So while the public was consumed by interviews, documentaries, and explosive claims, William was doing something else entirely. He was watching. He was listening. And most importantly, he was taking notes. Think about how unusual that is. In any other family, a public attack would be met with outrage, rebuttals, emotional appeals, maybe even reconciliation attempts made loudly, so everyone could see the effort. But that's not how future kings are trained to respond. They're trained to wait, to let people reveal themselves. And once they do, to decide how much risk they represent. Here's where things take an uncomfortable turn. Because according to people close to the royal machinery, William's silence wasn't passive. It was active restraint. A decision to stop shielding. A decision to stop smoothing things over. A decision to let consequences accumulate. Ask yourself this. Why didn't William publicly defend Harry when criticism intensified? Why didn't he step in when narratives spiraled out of control? Why did the once inseparable brothers suddenly feel like strangers occupying parallel universes? The answer might be simpler than anyone wants to admit. William stopped believing the situation was recoverable. And once that belief dies, everything changes. Because from that moment on, every interaction isn't about repair. It's about containment. Now let's talk about the statement again, but this time, let's talk about how it was received inside the system. Senior aides didn't react with panic. They didn't scramble. They nodded. That alone tells you everything. You don't nod at a bombshell unless you've already heard the explosion in private, which means this wasn't a surprise to the people who matter most. It was confirmation. Confirmation that a line had been crossed, acknowledged, and finally formalized. And here's the contradiction that confuses the public. William is often described as cautious, traditional, even emotionally reserved. So how does that square with a move that feels so cold, so decisive, so final? It squares perfectly, because this wasn't impulsive. It was institutional. It wasn't about punishing his brother. It was about protecting the future. That's the part people struggle to accept. Because protection, in this context, looks a lot like exile. Let's rewind even further. Long before the statement, before the departure, before the interviews, there were reportedly discussions about boundaries. What could be said? What could be monetized? What remained off limits? And those discussions weren't theoretical. They were warnings. Warnings that if certain lines were crossed, the response wouldn't be emotional. It would be structural, meaning access would change. Support would change. And yes, inheritance expectations would change too. Because royal inheritance isn't just about what you receive. It's about what you are trusted with. And trust, once broken, doesn't get renegotiated easily. This is where Prince Harry may have misread the situation entirely. Harry believed the bond would override the institution. William believed the institution had to override the bond. That difference in belief is everything. And it explains why the statement landed the way it did. Because to Harry, it likely felt personal. To William, it likely felt overdue. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle's role in this dynamic, because ignoring it would be dishonest. Meghan Markle didn't create the fracture, but she changed its trajectory, not by speaking, but by standing outside the system entirely. From the palace's perspective, that alone created an unsolvable problem. How do you manage someone who doesn't need you? How do you control narratives when cooperation is optional? And how do you maintain institutional authority when a senior royal family member builds an independent platform? Those questions don't produce emotional answers. They produce strategic ones. Which brings us back to inheritance. Because inheritance is leverage. It always has been. And when leverage disappears, institutions respond. Slowly, quietly, decisively. Here's the part no one wants to say out loud. This decision, whatever its exact mechanics, wasn't about teaching Harry a lesson. It was about sending a message to everyone else. A message to future spouses, to future insiders, to anyone who believes proximity to the crown guarantees permanence. It doesn't. Loyalty does. And loyalty, in this system, is defined by alignment with the institution, not personal truth. That's why the public reaction has been so polarized. Some see cruelty. Others see clarity. Some see betrayal. Others see leadership. And that split mirrors the divide inside the family itself. Now imagine being Prince William in that position. He's not just a brother. He's the man who will one day be responsible for the survival of an ancient system in a modern world that is increasingly hostile to inherited power. Every weakness is magnified. Every fracture is exploited. And family drama isn't just personal. It's political. So when people ask whether William went too far, they're asking the wrong question. The real question is this: did he believe he had any other option left? Because the moment he answered that question with no, the outcome became inevitable. The statement wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a long internal process. And that's why it feels so final. Because finality doesn't come from anger. It comes from acceptance. Acceptance that something cannot be fixed. Acceptance that certain costs must be paid. And acceptance that being king means choosing the crown over comfort. Still, one mystery remains unresolved. If this was all so carefully planned, so thoroughly considered, then why allow it to become public at all? Why not keep everything behind palace walls, as has been done for generations? The answer to that is chilling, because sometimes making something public is the only way to make it irreversible. And if that's true, then this statement wasn't just about inheritance. It was about closing doors permanently, which leads us to the next, more unsettling chapter. Because once a door like that closes, it doesn't just affect brothers. It reshapes the future of the monarchy itself. And what happened immediately after the statement, behind closed doors, suggests this was only the first move. So, if that was the first move, who exactly is Prince William becoming? Because once you accept that the statement wasn't emotional, wasn't reactive, and wasn't rushed, you're forced to confront something far more unsettling. This wasn't about the past. It was about the future, and more specifically, about the man who intends to rule it. Let me ask you a question that most people avoid. What happens when a boy raised in privilege, tragedy, and constant scrutiny finally decides that sentimentality is a weakness? Because that question sits at the heart of Prince William's transformation. To understand this chapter, you have to forget the headlines. Forget the smiling photographs. Forget the carefully staged appearances where he looks approachable, relaxed, almost ordinary. Those images are real, but they are not the whole truth. The truth is that Prince William has been preparing for this role since childhood. Not abstractly, not symbolically, systematically. While Prince Harry was being allowed to rebel, to test boundaries, to find himself, William was being trained to contain himself. That difference matters more than people realize. From a young age, William was taught something that Harry never fully absorbed. You don't get to choose when duty ends. Duty chooses you. And once it does, everything else becomes secondary. Now think back to the defining moment of their childhood. The walk behind their mother's coffin. The world saw two grieving boys. But inside the palace, something else happened. One was marked as the future. The other was protected as the spare. And that dynamic never truly disappeared. As adults, their lives diverged, but that underlying structure remained. William carried the weight of continuity. Harry carried the expectation of flexibility. That difference explains everything that followed. Because while Harry was encouraged to be human, William was encouraged to be stable. And stability, in royal terms, often looks like emotional restraint. That's why, for years, William's reactions seemed muted, controlled, sometimes even cold. But what if that wasn't emotional distance? What if it was discipline? Because discipline is what allows someone to make decisions others can't stomach. And that brings us to the heart of this chapter. The moment Prince William stopped seeing his brother primarily as family and started seeing him as a variable. That sounds harsh. But institutions don't survive by prioritizing feelings. They survive by managing risk. Now imagine being William during the height of the public fallout. Every interview reignites controversy. Every revelation fuels division. Every personal grievance becomes a political liability. And unlike Harry, William cannot walk away. He cannot opt out. He is tied to the institution whether he likes it or not. So while Harry reframed his life around authenticity and independence, William reframed his around containment and continuity. Two worldviews on a collision course. This is where the narrative flips. Because many people assume William's decision-making hardened because of anger. But insiders suggest something far more unsettling. Detachment. Detachment doesn't scream. It doesn't lash out. It calculates. And calculation is exactly what we see when you trace William's actions over the past few years. He stopped reacting publicly. He stopped defending privately. He started consolidating influence quietly. That's not the behavior of a wounded brother. That's the behavior of a man preparing to rule. Let's talk about something rarely discussed. Power inheritance. Not money. Not titles. Power. William understands something that Harry, by his own admission, struggled with. The monarchy isn't a family business. It's a system, and systems don't reward dissent. They absorb it, neutralize it, or remove it. When Harry and Meghan stepped outside that system, they didn't just create a family rift. They created a governance problem. Because suddenly, there were senior royals operating independently, speaking freely, monetizing their narrative, and rejecting institutional constraints. From a human perspective, that may be understandable. From an institutional perspective, it's intolerable. And William lives in the institutional perspective now. That's the shift. The man who once walked beside his brother now stands above the structure that defines them both. And once you cross, answer to that question reveals the real divide between them. Harry values expression. William values preservation. Neither is inherently wrong, but only one aligns with monarchy, and William knows that, which is why this decision feels less like betrayal and more like evolution. An evolution from brother to future king, from participant to authority. And that evolution didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages. Each controversy reinforced a conclusion. Each leak eroded trust. Each public revelation narrowed the margin for tolerance. Until eventually, William stopped asking how to fix the relationship and started asking how to protect the institution from it. That's the moment everything changed. Because once you see someone as a risk instead of a relative, the rules are different. You don't negotiate with risk. You manage it, contain it, or remove it. This is the reality many people don't want to confront. Prince William isn't becoming colder. He's becoming clearer. Clearer about what he can allow, clearer about what he can't, and clearer about the fact that the monarchy he will inherit cannot survive ambiguity at the top. So when people say this decision feels ruthless, they're not wrong. But ruthlessness, in this context, may simply be discipline applied without apology. And that's what scares people, because it suggests a monarchy that is done bending, done negotiating, done hoping family ties will outweigh institutional necessity. Which leads to a deeply unsettling thought. If Prince William is willing to draw this line with his own brother, what lines will he draw with everyone else? And more importantly, what happened between the brothers that convinced him this line had to be permanent? Because no one reaches this point without a final breaking moment. And that moment didn't happen in public. It happened between them. Oh, what was that breaking moment? What happened between two brothers who once promised they would face the world together? Because people like to point to interviews, to books, to public accusations, to headlines that felt explosive and humiliating. But fractures like this don't begin with microphones. They begin with silence. And the silence between Prince William and Prince Harry didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, almost politely. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people overlook. The brothers didn't break because they argued too much. They broke because they stopped arguing at all. Let me explain. For years, disagreements between William and Harry were reportedly intense but contained. Sharp words, raised voices, then resolution. That's how close relationships survive pressure. But at some point, something shifted. The arguments stopped leading anywhere. And when conflict stops producing movement, people withdraw. That's when distance becomes permanent. Now ask yourself this. What kind of disagreement is so serious that it makes a future king decide his own brother is no longer someone he can afford to protect? Because protection is the key word here. William protected Harry for years. From the press, from institutional consequences, from the full weight of royal expectation. And protection always comes with a condition. Trust. Once trust collapses, protection becomes liability. This is where the public narrative becomes misleading. People assume the breaking point was emotional betrayal, but insiders suggest it was something colder. Irreversibility. There were moments when William believed lines had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Moments when private conversations became public narratives. Moments when internal disagreements were reframed externally in ways that stripped the institution of control. And that matters more than people realize. Because the monarchy doesn't fear criticism. It fears loss of authority. Once authority is undermined publicly, restoring it becomes nearly impossible. And William understands that. Now imagine being in his position. You're watching your brother redefine his story in real time. Each revelation reframes the monarchy not as flawed, but as hostile. Each disclosure invites scrutiny not just of individuals, but of the system itself. And every time you choose silence, the narrative hardens without you. That creates a dilemma. Speak out and escalate. Stay silent and allow damage to deepen. William chose a third option. He disengaged. not emotionally. Strategically, this is where the fracture becomes final. Because disengagement is not a pause. It's a decision. And once William disengaged from repairing the relationship, the brothers stopped existing in the same emotional universe. Harry continued to speak as a participant. William began to think like an overseer. That shift is devastating in any family. But in this one, it's catastrophic. Let's talk about loyalty. Not emotional loyalty. Institutional loyalty. Harry's loyalty shifted toward personal truth, independence, and external validation. William's loyalty shifted toward continuity, stability, and internal coherence. Those loyalties are incompatible, and once that became clear, the relationship stopped being about forgiveness. It became about separation. Now here's where things get even darker. Because separation doesn't mean indifference. It means boundaries. And boundaries, in this case, meant reevaluating everything Harry once assumed was permanent. Access, support, and yes, inheritance expectations. People forget this. Royal inheritance isn't a birthright in the way people imagine. It's conditional, conditioned on alignment, conditioned on discretion, conditioned on trust. Once those conditions fail, assumptions collapse. And William knows exactly how those conditions work, which is why this wasn't an emotional snap. It was a reassessment. Let's revisit a moment people gloss over. When Harry publicly described feeling unprotected. That word matters. Because protection implies responsibility. And responsibility implies authority. William heard that differently than the public did. Not as pain, as accusation. An accusation that the institution failed. And if the institution failed, then William, as its future guardian, was implicated. That changes everything. Because now the issue isn't brother versus brother. It's narrative versus legitimacy. And legitimacy always wins inside a monarchy. So when people ask, why didn't William try harder to fix things? They misunderstand the dilemma. From William's perspective, fixing things required surrendering control of the narrative. And surrendering control is the one thing he cannot do. That's why the breaking moment didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural, gradual withdrawal, reduced communication, clearer boundaries. Until eventually, the relationship existed only in the past tense. This is where Meghan Markle enters the picture again, not as a villain, but as a mirror. Meghan Markle represented a future Harry wanted. A future without constraints, without deference, without silence. William didn't fear Meghan personally. He feared the precedent. Because if one senior royal could leave, speak freely, and retain institutional privileges, then the institution itself would fracture. And that is the nightmare scenario. So when Harry chose that path, William faced a brutal truth. He couldn't follow. And he couldn't allow the institution to follow either. Which means someone had to step away permanently. And it wasn't going to be the heir. Now pause here and really think about this. How do you reconcile with someone whose choices threaten the foundation of your entire future role? You don't. You adapt. You harden. You decide what matters more. And William decided. That's the breaking point. Not a fight. Not a betrayal. A realization. A realization that the brothers were no longer moving toward the same future. Once that realization set in, everything that followed became inevitable. The silence. The statement. The inheritance implications. They weren't reactions. They were consequences. This is why the public keeps misreading the situation. They're looking for drama. William was looking for resolution. And resolution doesn't always look kind. Now here's the most unsettling part of all. There may never have been a single final argument. No shouting match. No door slammed. Just a quiet moment when William accepted something most people never want to accept. That the relationship he remembered no longer existed. And that trying to revive it would endanger something far larger than his own feelings. That acceptance is what made the statement possible. That acceptance is what made the decision final. And that acceptance is what scares people. Because it tells us something profound about the future. This monarchy will not be governed by nostalgia. It will be governed by boundaries. Which leads us directly into the next chapter. Because once the brotherhood fractured, the power dynamics shifted. And when power shifts, everyone around it feels the shock. Especially the woman many believe changed everything. And what William came to believe about her role would harden his resolve even further. So what exactly changed when Meghan Markle entered the picture? And why did her presence seem to accelerate tensions that had already been quietly building for years? Because if you listen closely to how this story is usually told, it's framed far too simply. As if one person arrived and chaos followed. As if one relationship alone shattered an ancient institution. That version is easy. It's also incomplete. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Meghan Markle didn't break the monarchy. She exposed how fragile its internal balance already was. And Prince William understood that faster than almost anyone else. Let me ask you something. What happens when someone enters a rigid system and refuses, intentionally or not, to internalize its unspoken rules? Because the royal family doesn't function on written contracts alone. It runs on expectations that are never formally explained, yet strictly enforced. Silence, deference, patience, and above all, acceptance of hierarchy. Meghan didn't grow up inside that world. She wasn't trained to instinctively subordinate herself to it. And from the moment she arrived, that difference mattered. Not because she was outspoken, not because she was ambitious, but because she asked questions. And institutions built on tradition do not like questions, especially from people who don't need their approval to survive. This is where Prince William's perspective becomes critical. Unlike Harry, William didn't see Meghan as an emotional anchor or a symbol of escape. He saw her as a destabilizing variable, not malicious, not calculating, but unpredictable. And unpredictability is the single greatest threat to a system that depends on order. Now let's be clear. William's concern wasn't personal dislike. It was institutional risk. Meghan represented a new kind of royal spouse, one with her own platform, her own voice, her own sense of autonomy. That alone was unprecedented. And once Harry aligned himself fully with that autonomy, the risk multiplied. Because now you had a senior royal no longer operating under the system's constraints. From William's vantage point, this wasn't about emotion. It was about precedent. If Harry could step outside the system and retain influence, access, and perceived legitimacy, then what stopped others from doing the same? What stopped the monarchy from becoming optional? That's the fear people don't want to name. The fear that once loyalty becomes negotiable, authority collapses. And William, as the future king, could not allow that door to remain open. Now here's where things get more complicated. Because Harry didn't see Meghan as a risk. He saw her as clarity. She validated everything he already felt about the institution. Its rigidity, its emotional coldness, its unwillingness to evolve. In that sense, Meghan didn't change Harry. She confirmed him. And that confirmation created an alliance that William found deeply troubling. Not because it was romantic, but because it was unified. Harry and Meghan presented a single front, and that front was not aligned with the palace. In royal history, unity outside the institution is more threatening than rebellion within it. Because internal dissent can be managed. External independence cannot. This is where the brothers' perspectives diverged completely. Harry believed love justified separation. William believed separation demanded consequences. And once again, neither belief is inherently wrong. But only one is compatible with monarchy. Now think about the conversations that must have happened behind closed doors. Concerns expressed carefully. Warnings framed as advice. Boundaries explained without ever being written down. Those conversations rarely make headlines, but they shape outcomes. And according to those familiar with palace dynamics, William's unease wasn't immediate. It grew. Each instance where Harry and Meghan chose autonomy over alignment deepened that unease. Each moment where private matters became public narratives intensified it. Because from William's perspective, this wasn't just a couple telling their story. It was a couple redefining the monarchy's authority over its own image. And once that authority erodes, everything else follows. That's why this chapter matters so much. Because it reframes Meghan's role entirely. She wasn't the cause of the fracture. She was the catalyst that revealed it. The fracture already existed. Between duty and desire. Between continuity and change. Between preservation and reinvention. And William stood firmly on one side of that divide. Now let's address the contradiction that confuses people. If William is so cautious, so measured, why didn't he try harder to integrate Meghan? Why not adapt? Why not compromise? The answer is unsettling. Because compromise, in this case, would have required the institution to change faster than William believed it safely could. and rapid change is dangerous for systems built on slow evolution. William isn't blind to the monarchy's flaws. He's acutely aware of them. But awareness doesn't equal surrender. He believes reform must be controlled, managed, gradual. Meghan's presence represented acceleration. Acceleration of scrutiny. Acceleration of public debate. Acceleration of internal pressure. And acceleration is terrifying when you're responsible for long-term survival. So when Harry chose Meghan and her worldview fully, William didn't just see a brother making a personal choice. He saw a senior royal opting out of institutional discipline. That's the moment concern became alarm. And alarm eventually becomes action. Now let's talk about power again. Because power isn't just about titles. It's about who gets to set terms. Harry and Meghan wanted to set their own terms. William couldn't allow that to happen without redefining the monarchy itself. And redefining the monarchy wasn't his mandate. Preserving it was. That's why, from William's perspective, Meghan's influence wasn't negotiable. It had to be contained. Not because she was dangerous, but because the combination of her independence and Harry's status created a precedent too powerful to ignore. This is where the public narrative turns simplistic again. People say, why not just let them live their lives? Because living their lives independently while retaining royal legitimacy undermines the system's core logic. You can't be half inside and half outside. You're either bound by the institution or you're not. And once Harry chose not, William had to respond accordingly. This is where inheritance enters the conversation again. Inheritance is not a reward. It's a mechanism that reinforces alignment across generations. Once alignment breaks, mechanisms adjust. That's how systems protect themselves. So when people hear whispers of inheritance being canceled or expectations being quietly rewritten, they assume punishment. But from William's perspective, it's recalibration. You don't extend institutional privileges to those who reject institutional constraints. That's not cruelty. That's consistency. And consistency is the currency of legitimacy. Now pause here. Ask yourself honestly. If Meghan had fully embraced the traditional royal role, would things have been different? Possibly. But that would have required her to become someone she wasn't. And Harry knew that. Which means, at some level, he accepted the cost. What he may not have accepted was how far William was willing to go to enforce it. Because this wasn't just about distancing. It was about finality. The realization that there would be no hybrid future. No halfway status. No exception carved out of love. William didn't hate Meghan. He feared what her independence symbolized. A future where loyalty to the crown becomes optional. And for a future king, that future is unacceptable. This is why the statement felt so definitive. Because it wasn't rejecting a person. It was rejecting a model. A model where senior royals operate as free agents. And once that model is rejected, everything associated with it must be recalculated. Support, access, legacy, and yes, inheritance. This chapter isn't about blame. It's about incompatibility between two visions of what the monarchy should be. And William chose his. Which brings us to the next turning point. Because once Meghan's influence was identified as a structural risk, the palace didn't just worry about Harry. It began to worry about the future, about children, about succession, about what happens when independence becomes hereditary. And that concern would push William toward a decision even more controversial than the statement itself. Because once you start thinking in generational terms, there's no room for sentiment. And what William began to consider next would make everything that came before feel almost restrained. What happens when the monarchy starts thinking in generational terms? What happens when decisions stop being about one brother and start being about bloodlines, succession, and the future of the crown itself? Because this is where the story takes a sharp, unsettling turn. Up until now, everything could still be framed as emotional fallout, as family drama, as a tragic breakdown between two brothers who simply couldn't see eye to eye. But the moment inheritance enters the conversation, the stakes change completely. And not just any inheritance. Royal inheritance. Let's strip away the fantasy for a moment. Royal inheritance is not a sentimental bequest passed down with handwritten letters and family keepsakes. It is a system designed to preserve power, reinforce hierarchy, and ensure continuity across generations. And Prince William understands that system better than almost anyone alive. Here's the question most people don't want to confront. What if the inheritance issue wasn't triggered by anger, but by fear? Fear of what happens when royal legitimacy becomes fragmented across competing narratives. Fear of what happens when future generations grow up outside the system, yet still claim its benefits. Fear of a monarchy slowly losing control over its own lineage. Because once you see inheritance through that lens, the alleged cancellation stops looking punitive. It starts looking preventative. Let's talk about what inheritance actually represents inside the royal structure. It's not about money. Money is the least important part. Inheritance is access. Access to influence. Access to protection. Access to institutional back. It was confirming an internal conclusion. A conclusion that inheritance, in its fullest sense, could no longer be assumed. Now let's talk about the contradiction that unsettles people the most. Prince William is often portrayed as compassionate, emotionally aware, and deeply committed to mental health and family values. So how does that align with a decision that appears to sever generational support? The answer is deeply uncomfortable. Because compassion at the institutional level looks very different from compassion at the personal level. Personal compassion seeks healing. Institutional compassion seeks survival. And survival sometimes requires decisions that feel unforgiving. This is where William's role becomes tragically clear. He cannot afford to be only a brother. He must be a gatekeeper. And gatekeepers don't ask whether decisions feel fair. They ask whether decisions preserve order. Now think about how this must have landed with Harry. To Harry, inheritance represented security. A guarantee that no matter how far he stepped away, the connection remained. To discover that connection might not be permanent would feel like betrayal, like abandonment, like being written out. But from William's perspective, permanence without alignment was unsustainable. And this is where the tragedy deepens. Because both perspectives make sense. They're just incompatible. Harry wants freedom with connection. William wants connection with discipline. And inheritance sits at the crossroads of that conflict. That's why this chapter matters so much. Because once inheritance expectations shift, everything else follows. Titles become symbolic. Relationships become formal. Distance becomes structural. And the possibility of reconciliation diminishes. Because you can forgive words. You can forgive interviews. You can even forgive public embarrassment. But once institutional trust is withdrawn, rebuilding it becomes almost impossible. Now here's the part few people talk about openly. Inheritance decisions aren't reversed easily. They set trajectories. They shape futures. And they signal intent. So when Prince William allowed a statement to go out that even hinted at inheritance recalibration, he wasn't just addressing the present. He was shaping the future. A future where the monarchy draws firmer lines. Where proximity to the crown requires alignment. And where independence comes with real consequences. That future scares people. Because it suggests a monarchy that is less forgiving. Less flexible. More controlled. But from William's perspective, flexibility is what brought the institution to this crisis point in the first place. He believes clarity is the solution. Even if clarity hurts. Now consider this. If inheritance expectations had remained unchanged, what incentive would there be for alignment? If stepping away carried no long-term cost, what would stop others from following the same path? That's the question William couldn't ignore. And once he asked it, the answer became unavoidable. Inheritance had to be redefined. Not publicly, not dramatically, but structurally. Which brings us to the most unsettling realization of all. This wasn't just about Harry. It was about preventing a model from spreading. A model where royal status becomes portable. Where legitimacy exists independently of the institution. Where the crown loses its gravitational pull. William saw that future. And he rejected it. That rejection explains the tone of the statement. It explains the silence that followed. And it explains why this decision feels so final. Because once you redefine inheritance, you redefine belonging. And once belonging is redefined, reconciliation becomes symbolic at best. This is the moment when the story stops being about a feud and starts being about governance. About a future king who believes the monarchy must be protected from ambiguity at any cost. Which leads directly into the next chapter. Because once inheritance is recalibrated, the fallout doesn't stop with one couple. It ripples outward, into public opinion, into political pressure, into a divided nation trying to decide whether this was leadership or cruelty. And the way Britain reacted to this shift would shock everyone involved. Because instead of turning on William, something very different happened. And what the public did next would change the narrative entirely. So how did Britain respond when inheritance stopped being a private assumption and started looking like a public boundary? Because if you expected outrage, backlash, or mass sympathy to swing decisively in one direction, you're not alone. That's what many inside the palace feared too. But what actually happened caught almost everyone off guard. Let me ask you something. What if the most shocking part of this entire saga wasn't Prince William's decision, but the fact that a large portion of the public quietly agreed with it? That realization is where this chapter begins. Because when the implications of the statement began to sink in, Britain didn't explode. It paused, and that pause was telling. For years, public sympathy had leaned heavily toward Prince Harry. His vulnerability, his honesty, his willingness to speak about pain in a system that often refuses to acknowledge it. That sympathy didn't disappear overnight, but something complicated it. Fatigue. Fatigue with constant revelation. Fatigue with perpetual grievance. Fatigue with a story that no longer seemed to be moving toward healing. So when whispers of inheritance recalibration surfaced, many people didn't ask, how could William do this? They asked something else entirely. How long was this inevitable? That question changed the entire narrative. Because suddenly, Prince William wasn't being viewed solely as a cold brother. He was being viewed as a man doing what no one else wanted to do. Draw a line. And lines, as it turns out, are something the public understands more than endless ambiguity. Now let's be clear. This wasn't universal support. Britain was divided, but not in the way people expected. The divide wasn't between those who loved Harry and those who didn't. It was between those who still believed in institutional boundaries and those who believed personal truth should override them. And that's a much deeper fault line, one that runs through British society itself. Older generations, raised with a strong sense of duty and hierarchy, largely saw William's move as overdue. Not kind, not pleasant, but necessary. Younger audiences were more conflicted. They empathized with Harry's pain, but struggled with the idea that you could publicly reject an institution while still expecting it to sustain you indefinitely. That tension played out everywhere. In editorials, in call-in shows, in quiet conversations at kitchen tables. And what surprised palace insiders most wasn't the criticism. It was the restraint. There were no mass protests, no dramatic calls for abdication, no surge of anti-William sentiment. Instead, there was a slow, uncomfortable acceptance that something fundamental had shifted, that the monarchy was no longer trying to please everyone. And that realization reframed everything. Let's talk about media reaction, because it's revealing. Early coverage was cautious, hedging language, careful phrasing, speculation wrapped in restraint. But as days passed, the tone evolved. Commentators began to frame the situation less as a family tragedy and more as a governance issue. That framing matters. Because once something is seen as governance, emotion takes a back seat. Principle moves forward. And the principle being debated was simple, but brutal. Can someone reject the rules of an institution while still benefiting from its protections? For many people, the answer was no. Not because they lacked empathy, but because they understood precedent. And precedent is everything in systems that survive on continuity. This is where Prince William's strategy becomes clearer. By allowing the implications of inheritance recalibration to surface gradually, without sensational confirmation or denial, he let the public wrestle with the logic themselves. And many did. They may not have liked it, but they understood it. That understanding softened what could have been a public relations disaster. Now consider the contrast. If William had framed this emotionally, as betrayal or personal hurt, the reaction would have been brutal. But he didn't. He framed it institutionally. And institutions, when they appear to act consistently, tend to retain public trust even when they disappoint. This is the irony most people miss. William's emotional restraint made the decision more palatable, not less. Because people trust systems more than they trust feelings, especially when feelings have dominated the narrative for years. Now let's talk about the silent majority. The people who didn't tweet, didn't comment, didn't argue. They just nodded and moved on. That group matters more than loud critics. And their reaction was telling. They saw the inheritance issue not as cruelty, but as closure. Closure to a saga that had dragged on with no resolution. Closure to a family conflict that seemed incapable of ending on its own. Closure to ambiguity. And ambiguity is something societies struggle with. Now imagine being Prince Harry watching this unfold. Not just the headlines, but the tone beneath them. The subtle shift from sympathy to resignation. From outrage to acceptance. That realization would sting more than criticism. Because criticism still implies engagement. Acceptance implies finality. And finality is the one thing Harry may not have fully anticipated. This is where the emotional imbalance becomes stark. Harry has spoken openly about feeling abandoned. But from the public's perspective, something else was happening. They felt the monarchy was finally asserting boundaries that should have existed all along. That doesn't mean they stopped caring about Harry. It means they stopped expecting the institution to bend endlessly. And that shift emboldened William. Not publicly, but internally. Because public legitimacy is oxygen. And William realized he still had it. Even after drawing a hard line. That realization changes everything. Now let's address another contradiction. Why didn't politicians intervene? Why didn't Parliament react more forcefully? Because this wasn't a constitutional crisis. It was an internal recalibration. And that distinction protected William. As long as no laws were broken and no constitutional norms were violated, there was little appetite for interference. The monarchy had handled its own. Quietly. Firmly. Which reinforced the perception of control. Now here's the part people underestimate. Public reaction doesn't just reflect opinion. It shapes future decisions. And the lack of overwhelming backlash sent a powerful message. William could act decisively and survive it. That's a dangerous lesson. Not because it makes him reckless, but because it removes hesitation. If this boundary could be drawn without collapse, others could follow. Stronger ones. More controversial ones. And that realization likely hardened William's resolve. Because now he knew something critical. The public was ready for a firmer monarchy. Not necessarily a warmer one, but a clearer one. This is where the story pivots. Because up until this point, everything could still be framed as damage control, as managing fallout, as responding to crisis. But after seeing the public reaction, William likely saw opportunity. An opportunity to redefine expectations, to reset the relationship between the crown and those who orbit it. And that reset doesn't stop with inheritance. Inheritance was just the signal. The real shift was philosophical. The monarchy would no longer chase reconciliation at the expense of coherence. It would prioritize stability, even if it cost popularity with certain segments. And once that philosophy takes hold, decisions start to cascade. Which brings us to the most revealing development of all. Because while the public was processing the implications, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something quieter. Something more procedural. Advisors weren't debating whether William had gone too far. They were discussing how far he could go next. And that conversation would lead to a move that made the inheritance issue feel almost symbolic. Because once you start redrawing boundaries, you don't stop at finances. You move into structure, access, and roles. And what William considered next would redefine the monarchy's internal dynamics in ways few people were prepared for. Because the next step wasn't about Harry and Meghan at all. It was about the kind of crown William intends to wear. Where does a future king go once he realizes he can draw a line and survive it? Because that's the moment when restraint stops being a virtue and starts feeling like an obstacle. And that moment, according to those who understand how power actually works, is when Prince William drew his real line. Not publicly, not emotionally, but internally. This chapter isn't about what the world saw. It's about the decision that crystallized everything. The moment William stopped asking how to manage the fallout and started deciding how far he was willing to go. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What would it take for you to accept that reconciliation is no longer just unlikely, but undesirable? Because that's the psychological threshold William crossed. And once you cross it, everything that follows feels inevitable. Up until that point, there was still room for ambiguity. Room for informal channels. Room for private repair. Room for symbolic gestures that left doors cracked open. But ambiguity is dangerous for leaders, especially future kings. Ambiguity invites challenge. It invites reinterpretation. It invites people to believe rules are flexible. And flexibility is exactly what William came to see as the problem. Here's what most people miss. The line wasn't drawn in anger. It was drawn in clarity. Clarity that the situation had shifted from personal conflict to institutional risk. Clarity that continued ambiguity would weaken authority. Clarity that a decisive moment was required. That clarity didn't arrive suddenly. It built. Every time a private disagreement became a public narrative. Every time silence was interpreted as guilt. Every time restraint was framed as weakness. At some point, William realized something crucial. The strategy of quiet containment wasn't containing anything anymore. It was enabling it. And that's when his mindset changed. This is the point where people misinterpret William's character. They assume he hardened. In reality, he simplified. He stopped weighing emotional variables. He stopped factoring in optics that couldn't be controlled. He reduced the situation to one fundamental question. Does this relationship, in its current form, strengthen or weaken the institution I will inherit? Once he answered that question, everything else fell away. And the answer, by all indications, was clear. It weakens it. Now think about how difficult that conclusion must have been. This isn't a man cutting off a distant relative. This is a brother acknowledging that his own flesh and blood represents a structural liability. That's not cruelty. That's devastation processed through duty. And duty, once activated at that level, overrides almost everything else. So the line William drew wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. He stopped granting the benefit of doubt. He stopped assuming good faith would eventually lead to alignment. He stopped planning for reconciliation. Instead, he planned for separation. That's the line. And once you decide separation is the end state, the next steps become almost mechanical. You define boundaries. You formalize distance. You remove gray areas. And you communicate finality. That's what the statement represented. Not a threat. Not a warning. A confirmation that the line had already been drawn. Here's another uncomfortable truth. William didn't draw the line to hurt his brother. He drew it to protect himself from future compromise. Because compromise, at that point, would have signaled hesitation. And hesitation is dangerous when authority is under scrutiny. Think about the broader context. The monarchy is navigating unprecedented pressure. Public trust is fragile. Media scrutiny is relentless. The margin for error is razor-thin. In that environment, a future king cannot afford open-ended family conflict that spills into public discourse indefinitely. It creates instability. And instability erodes legitimacy. So when William chose to draw the line, he wasn't choosing against Harry. He was choosing for continuity. That distinction matters. Now let's talk about the moment that reportedly sealed it. Not an argument, not a confrontation, but a realization. A realization that no version of future coexistence would satisfy both sides. Harry wanted independence with institutional connection. William wanted institutional coherence without exceptions. Those two visions cannot coexist. And once William accepted that, the decision stopped being painful. It became necessary. That's the moment people rarely understand. The most dangerous decisions are not the ones made in anger. They're the ones made in calm acceptance. Because calm acceptance doesn't reverse itself. This is where William's advisors come into the picture. Not as puppet masters, but as mirrors. They didn't push him toward this conclusion. They confirmed what he already knew. That leaving doors half open invites future crises. That precedent matters more than sentiment. That clarity, once established, must be defended. And that defense sometimes requires appearing ruthless. So William didn't escalate emotionally. He didn't engage publicly. He didn't retaliate. He drew a line and let the system enforce it. That's why the move felt so different. It wasn't reactive. It was definitive. Now consider the psychological impact of that on Harry. Because from Harry's perspective, the conflict was still alive, still emotional, still negotiable. From William's perspective, it was already over. That mismatch is devastating. One brother speaking as if the story is ongoing. The other behaving as if the chapter has closed. That's how people get blindsided. Not by hostility, by finality. And that's exactly what happened. The line William drew wasn't visible at first. But once it became visible, it was immovable. This is why the inheritance issue felt so shocking. Because inheritance symbolizes permanence. And William was signaling something profound. Permanence is conditional. Belonging is conditional. And conditions, once violated, don't reset automatically. That's a terrifying message for anyone who believed blood guaranteed access. But from an institutional perspective, it's logical. Now let's confront the moral question people keep asking. Was William right? That question misses the point. The real question is this: could William have drawn any other line and still preserved authority? If the answer is no, then the choice was already made for him. Leadership isn't about picking the kindest option. It's about picking the option you believe will hold. And William believed this would hold. So when the statement went out, it wasn't opening a debate. It was closing one. Closing the possibility of informal reconciliation. Closing the expectation of inherited permanence. Closing the chapter on ambiguity. And that's why